Good morning. Paul wants to experience the power of Christ's resurrection. Why? Because in experiencing the power of Christ's resurrection, he secures his own resurrection. 1 Corinthians 15:12 through 14. Now, if Christ is proclaimed as raised from the dead, how can some of you say there's no resurrection of the dead? Paul asked that question. It's rhetorical. The point is, when we teach the resurrection of Christ, right, there's an implication with that. The implication is that Christ is the first fruits of our resurrection. Christ, in that way, is the progenitor of our resurrection. He is the one leading the way of our resurrection. Verse 13 of 1 Corinthians 15 goes on and says, but if there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. He goes back the other way. If people are saying, apparently people were teaching the Corinthians that, hey, wait a minute, when you die, that's it, there's no resurrection of the dead. And Paul's saying, wait a minute, what do you think the resurrection of Christ was all about? If there's no resurrection of the dead, then you do the CSI work. You go back and there was no crime, so to speak. There's no crime scene committed. There was no resurrection of the dead in Christ. Christ did not raise from the dead if in fact there's no future resurrection. But if there is a future resurrection, then we know that is only the case because Christ was raised. So in verse 14 he says, and if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain and your faith is in vain. We're wasting our time. So for Paul, he doesn't play around with the resurrection. It's not this idea of some etherealized metaphor of Jesus being spiritually raised but not bodily raised. There's no such thing for Paul. Either there's a real resurrection and we enter into the power of it by believing and trusting in Christ, and we are buried with him in the likeness of his death and raised to walk in newness of life because of a real resurrection, or not. And that's why in verse 11, he says this phrase, that by any means possible, I may attain the resurrection from the dead. Paul, by any means possible, Paul is passionate that he'll be with Christ. He treasures Christ. He's passionate that he'll live in eternity. His point here isn't that he doubts it. It's not that he's saying, well, whatever it takes, maybe I can make it. No. It's that Paul is in humility extolling and marveling at the truth that he, of all people, that he would be able to attain the resurrection of the dead because of the power of Christ's resurrection. You, my friend, if you have believed in Christ, you will be raised in the last day. The Bible teaches you that. 1 Corinthians 15 makes that clear, as does other texts, but boy, that text does. Here, this is Paul celebrating. I want to know Christ in the power of his resurrection. I'm willing to endure the fellowship of his sufferings. Why? Because there's a resurrection that awaits me. Boy, take courage. Take courage in that resurrection day. Take care.